Let's jump right into this fascinating explainer. Today, we're unpacking a massive recurring failure mode in academic, medical, and technocratic reasoning. It's an epistemological danger that is literally hiding in plain sight. We're talking about the overwhelming tendency of institutions to diagnose exactly why someone disagrees with them before they ever take a second to check if that person is actually right. Think about what happens when institutions face serious public resistance. Whether we're talking about a brand new health mandate, a controversial monetary policy, or some massive environmental assessment, academic and medical institutions naturally pivot to a very specific, purely psychological question. Why do people doubt us? They instantly want to know what kind of childhood the dissenter had, what their political identity is, or if they're just naturally prone to anxiety. But here is where it gets really interesting, because we need to flip the script entirely. What actually happens to a society when we systematically discount the very people who might be identifying a massive institutional error? What if, just what if, the institution is the one making the mistake, and the skeptic has actually hit the nail on the head and found a critical flaw in the data? Section 1. Pathologizing dissent. The trap of the why. To really understand this trap of obsessing over the why while totally ignoring the substance of a disagreement, the source material points us to a really powerful 2022 longitudinal study by Moffitt. This wasn't your everyday run-of-the-mill survey. The researchers had psychological data stretching all the way back into the participants' childhoods. They neutrally observed that COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy strongly correlated with deep-seated psychological histories, things like adverse childhood experiences, mental health problems, negative emotionality, nonconformism, and fatalism. Section 2, the missing question. Explaining the decision versus adjudicating the fact. Treating those personality traits as the ultimate, final explanation for a person's decision creates a glaring intellectual blind spot. It completely confuses explaining a decision with adjudicating a fact. Look, psychology is fantastic at investigating question A. Why is this person predisposed to doubt? But it absolutely cannot substitute for figuring out question B. Is the underlying proposition actually true? Finding a correlation between a psychological trait and a decision doesn't magically prove that the decision itself is factually wrong. This brilliantly illustrates the entire problem. Let's imagine two totally different individuals. Person A makes a wild empirical claim that can be super easily investigated and falsified, like a tracking device. But person B is over here doing a highly meticulous, completely valid regulatory analysis based on FDA documents and product labeling. But here is the massive danger. In behavioral data sets, both of these people just get lumped together under the exact same behavioral outcome of vaccine resistant. Doing that completely destroys the distinction between a totally false belief and a carefully reasoned, rational objection. Because researchers were so laser-focused on the psychology of generalized mistrust, they totally missed categorizing these conceptually different, rationally grounded objections. If you are only looking at personality traits, you're going to completely miss the folks who are objecting because of a strict legal contradiction, an informed consent issue, or, and this is absolutely crucial, distrust that was directly caused by the institution acting poorly or changing its own story. Section 3. Technocratic paternalism. The attribution error. This attribution error creates a subtle but really profound epistemic asymmetry. Basically, the institution is automatically presumed to possess flawless, perfect expertise, while the dissenting citizen is presumed to just have cognitive limitations. This mode of attribution shifts the burden of proof so heavily that the actual argument completely vanishes. A skeptic objects, and the institution says, well, you're just distrustful. So the skeptic brings more evidence, and the institution looks at that persistence and says, see? This is just more evidence of your angry fixation. It becomes a completely closed loop. It's an epistemically closed system where dissent is treated like a literal disease to be diagnosed instead of an argument to be evaluated. Now, let's be real for a second and keep our balance here. As the source text rightly points out, most dissenters are definitely not Galileo. Some are literally just people who watched a really convincing YouTube video at 2 a.m., right? We do not need to romanticize every single contrarian out there. Plenty of dissenters are misinformed, driven by ideology, or just flat out wrong. But, and this is the absolute core of the scientific method, a proposition doesn't magically become false just because the person advancing it is angry, alienated, or disagreeable. Science exists for the exact reason that credentials and personality do not reliably determine the truth. Section 4, a better scientific model. Evaluating the three axes. To fix this giant blind spot, the source material proposes a brilliantly simple three-axis solution. This model breaks down controversial decision-making way more objectively, so we don't just accidentally write off rational thinkers. Instead of just putting the individual's mind under a microscope, which is axis 1, a rigorous inquiry has to independently analyze all three of these domains. We have to isolate the exact, falsifiable proposition they hold in axis 2. And critically, in axis 3, we must independently examine the performance of the institution itself. Did the institution accurately disclose uncertainty? Did they suppress contrary evidence? You have to look at the whole shebang.
For that second axis, we need to actively score the proposition by actually breaking down the disagreements and grading the specific claims on a clear scale, from definitively false all the way up to correct. We stop a broad, lazy behavioral label like non-compliant from acting as a proxy for actual rationality. Someone might reach a medically unfavorable decision, but they could have gotten there through entirely logically coherent reasoning based on the incomplete information they had at that specific time.
Try this fascinating counterfactual test proposed by the source to expose the flaw in how academic research often operates. Ask yourself this: if later evidence conclusively proves the skeptic was actually correct about the disputed proposition all along, would the researcher's psychological explanation of that person change? If you run this test and the answer is no, it exposes a massive, glaring problem. It means that what academics paternalistically brushed off as maladaptive mistrust might have actually been highly successful anomaly detection. The psychological trait didn't cause an epistemic failure, it caused a total epistemic success. Section 5. Preserving error detectors. Compliance is not rationality. At the end of the day, allowing mere compliance to become an implicit measure of rationality embeds policy preference directly into the scientific method itself. We have to completely separate the concept of being compliant from the concept of being rational. Complex, highly technocratic societies desperately need people with the exact traits we've been discussing. We need folks who notice anomalies, who hate unexplained inconsistencies, and who are willing to take huge reputational hits just to ask the hard questions. Sure, in ordinary times, these people can be a bit socially inconvenient. But when expert consensus is mistaken, they serve as our vital, irreplaceable error correction mechanism. The incredible irony here is that pathologizing these exact traits during a period of real institutional failure is incredibly dangerous. If you diagnose every single skeptic as having a psychological defect, you risk optimizing a population to implement bad policy very efficiently. Think about that. A genuinely healthy system requires both competent expertise and highly competent dissent. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final, absolutely vital question to chew on. Before we rush to diagnose the psychology or the childhood or the politics of everyone who disagrees with the consensus, we have to first have the epistemic humility to stop and ask, what did they see that we might have missed? We must test the dissenter's proposition before we try to explain the dissenter. Only by doing that can we ensure we never accidentally silence the very error detectors that our entire civilization depends on. Keep that in mind the next time you see a major consensus being challenged. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive.